It's a short Friday, and we haven't got long, so we'll try and maximize the time that we have. Today is Asara B'Teves, one of the 6 fast days in the Jewish year, and I think it's a very appropriate day to have an assembly to bring in 2 people who are very beloved in our community, Mr. and Mrs. Manfred Goldberg, and Asara B'Teves commemorates the beginning of the Churban. 3 years before the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel, sieged Jerusalem. 2.5 years later, it was Shivos of Tammuz, there was a breach in the wall, and 3 weeks after that was Tisha B'Av, was the destruction of the first temple. And the whole concept of Churban and destruction flowed from that. And Mr. Goldberg, as you'll hear soon, is a survivor, and is a survivor of Churban and destruction in more recent times of the Holocaust. And we're going to do this assembly in the form of an interview. And I'm going to ask Mr. Goldberg questions, and please give him your full attention. So, Mr. Goldberg, you were born in 1930.
Yeah.
You were 3 years old when Hitler came to power, 9 when the war broke out. What do you remember of life before the war?
Well, I would like to give you a tiny bit of background of our family. Both my parents came from very religious homes, born in Poland, and my father fled to Germany. In his family, it was the minhag for boys to be sent to yeshiva age 14, and he spent more than 4 years in yeshiva. Then he approached the age when he would be called up for military service. He told me he was a young man with payas, and he could not possibly survive in the anti-Semitic Polish army, where there was no facility for kosher food. It would have been ongoing hell. So he decided he had to flee for safety. With his parents' blessings, he made his way to Germany, where he met a young lady from an equally frum home. They married, settled in Germany, and I was born in 1930. As you heard, I was only 3 years old when the Nazis came to power. At 3 years old, I wasn't really aware of what was happening or what was the prospect for Jewish people. But the Nazis wasted no time. They passed dozens of anti-Jewish laws, an unending stream, hundreds of them. And by the time I sort of grew a little older, I began to feel the effect already. One of the things the Nazis did was to form a national youth group, like the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts in this country. And they were, of course, brainwashed into Jew hatred. Young minds are susceptible, and by the time I was a little older, we began to feel sort of a form of persecution from young German, mainly boys, who readily accepted the anti-Semitic poison that was being sort of poured into their minds. And life began to get progressively harder. There was very little social life. There was only one school, one Jewish school in our town, and eventually when I was 6 years old, I was enrolled in that Jewish school. I recall one particular experience when I was, I think, around 5 years old. My father, Oliver Sholem, took me on a day's outing. We went to visit a castle where there was facilities for children to entertain themselves. And we had a great day out. We were getting off the tram going home, and as we turned the corner, we found that the street was packed with thousands of people. There was no way of getting through. And it turned out that they had all turned out because Hitler, Yamashima, was visiting Kassel, and he would pass by standing in an open car. and they were all eagerly awaiting his arrival. I can tell you that by then the situation was such that if we had pushed our way through, indifferent to what was about to happen, it would have been a very dangerous thing to do. So my father had the good sense to stop and join the crowd. Eventually, I actually saw him pass by because he had to lift me up in order to conform with what everybody else did. And the most remarkable thing, which I do remember because I became aware of it a little later, was that when he passed by in the car and everybody lifted their arm in a Hitler salute, my father had to do likewise, because not doing so would already have endangered us severely.
Wow. So you saw Hitler in 1936. Your school shut down was closed down in 1940, and then you together with your mother and your brother, were deported to the Riga ghetto. Can you describe your experiences in the ghetto?
Yes. We were deported from Kassel, a group of 1,000 of us. I didn't know at the time, but it included one of the teachers who taught me for my brief period in the Jewish school which I had been attending. In Riga, all adults had to work daily. They were marched out under guard to work in factories, manufacturing things to assist the Nazi war effort. But in this camp, uniquely, I was in a total of 5 different camps. And in every subsequent camp, if you were too young to work, too old to work, too frail to work, if you were disabled in some way, you lost your right to live. In this first camp, they had a policy of allowing youngsters below the age of 13 were excused from work. Everyone aged 13 plus had to march out daily under guard to work to assist the Nazi war effort. But children up to the age of 13 could remain in the camp. Of course, we were without parents. All our parents had to work daily. Then I was about just past my 12th birthday. This teacher who knew me from when I attended the Jewish primary school said to me, "You've passed your 12th birthday, your bar mitzvah is coming up. I know your father is not with you. I don't have time to go into detail, but my father was permitted by the Nazis to flee Germany, not the family, just my father, as an alternative to being sent to a concentration camp. We were meant to follow within a few weeks, but 10 days after my father, Oliver Scholem, left Germany under duress, the Second World War began, and my mother, Oliver Scholem, my younger brother and I were trapped in Germany. Now all 3 of us were in the camp. So was this teacher, who I will never forget. His name was Herr Bacher. I never knew his first name. Discipline was rather different between students or school boys and their teachers. That there was a real derech eretz for teachers. He, in the camp, approached me and said, "Would you like me to prepare you for your bar mitzvah? I know your father is not with you." I was a good lad, so I said, "Yes, please." And he began teaching me what Sedra he had calculated would be my bar mitzvah seder in a year's time. He didn't have a luach, he had to do it all mentally. And he decided that my bar mitzvah parsha would be Parshas Tzav. One thing I must tell you, very briefly, I know we're very short of time. The camp we were in had been occupied by 30,000 Riga Jews who were forced to leave their homes and live in the camp. And they were allowed to take a few personal belongings with them into the camp. Quite a few of them were Rabbonim. Some were Rabbonim leading various Botei Knesset. Among 30,000, there were quite a number of shuls in town. So what a Rav thinks of taking with first, before anything else, of course, is a Sefer Torah. So there were quite a few Sefer Torah in the camp. Before we arrived, the Nazis carried out a devilish massacre. All 30,000 Riga Jews were murdered. There are still 3 mass graves in a forest outside Riga, which is where the camp was. To this day, these Jews were misled, told they were being taken to another camp. Instead, they were taken into the forest and were murdered. And they were not allowed to take any of their belongings, which meant that there were a number of Sefer Torah left in the ghetto when it was now repopulated with German Jews, of whom we were part. So he began teaching me initially, attempting only one parsha of the Seder of Tzav. But when he found out that I was a good learner, he began teaching me more. Eventually he taught me the whole of the parsha, the weekly parsha, and he also had calculated that it would be Shabbos Parshas Porah, so he taught me the extra plus the correct Haftarah. And there was never, in my experience, a religious service in Riga, nor in any other camp. My Shabbos, Bar Mitzvah Shabbos in the camp was the only religious service in the 3.5 years I spent in the camps. When it came to my Shabbos, Bar Mitzvah Shabbos, miraculously, he had organized for 9 men to attend. All this, of course, was secret. No one knew about it. It was all done sort of below
radar.
That's right, below the radar, yes. I don't know. It certainly couldn't have happened if the Nazis had got to know about it. And I was very proud to be number 10. We had a Shabbos morning service. As I said, it was the only one in 3.5 years. I learned the whole parsha. We had a conventional, of course, religious. He was quite a religious person. And I was called up. I learned all the parsha, all the whole seder, and I was called up for maftir.
Wow.
Unforgettable.
So your bar mitzvah in the camp in Riga Ghetto was very different to what these young men have ever experienced. Their bar mitzvahs not that long ago. In August 1943, just 5 months after your bar mitzvah, you were sent to a nearby labor camp, and then a year later to the notorious Stutthof concentration camp. Can you describe your experiences there?
Yes. Before being sent to Stutthof, we were sent to a labor camp, which of course did not have the same policy as the first camp. And my little brother had to stay in the camp. I was considered strong enough to be a slave laborer, so both my mother, Leah Sholem, and I had to go out to work every day. My little brother, plus a few other youngsters, were permitted to stay in the camp. After a few weeks there, we came back from work one day, and the children had been taken away. At the time, there was no such thing as mourning in camps. You may find this difficult to believe, but heartbroken as both my mother, Leah Sholem, and I were at the disappearance of my younger brother, with whom I had a very strong bond, because in the first camp I had to look after him daily while my mother was at work. But life was such that the following morning both my mother and I had to line up and go out to work as though nothing untoward had happened. Heartbreaking as it was, we had to labor to stay alive. We were sent, from that camp we were sent to the concentration camp of Stutthof. Stutthof was effectively a mini Auschwitz. It was much, much smaller, but although it was originally built as a very small camp, and no Jews were sent there, just German anti-Nazis and Polish resistance fighters, At the end of 1942, they were forced to labor inside the camp to extend it to, in fact, triple it in size. From a capacity of 8,000, it was now enlarged to hold 25,000. And while they were building all these new barracks and a new high voltage fence around the camp, at the same time, they also built a gas chamber and a crematorium into the camp. So Auschwitz, not Auschwitz, Stutthof now became a camp like Auschwitz, which had mass extermination facilities. We became the envy of the camp when we were told that just our slave labor gang of 300 would be sent on to another labor camp, which indeed happened, and we had to do the same work in the second camp as we had done before being sent to Stutthof, which was to work on railway lines which the Allies had begun bombing. The Allies began to realize that the railway system was vital to the Nazi war effort. All their war transportations were made via the railway system, so they began bombing it, and we, a group of slave laborers, were forced to dig up the damaged railway lines, replace them, and sort of finalize everything to make sure the line was serviceable again.
Mm-hmm. So, after a year in Stutthof, and a year before that in another labour camp, Stutthof was liberated in May 1945. Sadly, your younger brother did not survive, but you and your mother did. And when you made your way after the war to England, your father had been there for 7 years or so, as you just described.
Yes.
That must have been a very emotional reunion.
Indeed. It was. It was a bittersweet reunion because we were now a family, but not a complete family. My younger brother, sadly, heartbreakingly, rather than sadly, lost his life. To this day, although we made numerous and years of inquiries about finding out his fate, we found out absolutely nothing. The Nazis have a reputation for having been meticulous. In fact, some survivors managed to find out the dates their parents were murdered because the Nazis kept a record of it. But despite our numerous searches, we have not found out my little brother's fate. But knowing the Nazis' attitude towards non-productive Jews, who immediately lost their right to live once they became too weak to work, it eventually was inevitable to come to the conclusion that these young children who disappeared the same day as my little brother all lost their lives on the day they were taken. So it was joyful but bittersweet, as I said, being reunited as a family. There was then a little controversy, effectively, between my parents. My father, Oliver Scholem, and this will tell you the type of person he was. He wanted me to attend a yeshiva. My mother, Leah Scholem, said he's lost 7 years of secular schooling as well as Jewish education. We must give him an opportunity to try and catch up on some of this learning. Well, the yeshiva path was tried, but as I had left school at age 9, I was not yeshiva material. I began attending part-time a local yeshiva known as Schneider's Yeshiva in Stamford Hill. Rabbi Schneider was a malach. He brought over quite a large number of youngsters from Morocco, and he founded the yeshiva, which primarily Moroccans. They did try, but I was not yeshiva material. But something quite remarkable happened. I had attended a crash course in English in a Jewish school called the Avigdor Grammar School, and I was interviewed by the head mistress, Rabbi Manfred, and without telling me anything, she prompted 2 staff members. One was a Rav, who was a teacher there now. Then, later he was the headmaster of Menorah Primary School, and his name was Rabbi Yisrael Cohen Halevi. A very unusual name, stunning Yisrael. And he was being a Levi, Yisrael Cohen. So he contacted me and asked me every Shabbos afternoon to come round to his house, where he would very gently sort of guide me through the weekly parsha, and began sort of teaching me gently. I will never be able to thank them enough.
Well, it's a full circle, because his grandson teaches in the school, and Rabbi Schoenfeld, of course, founded Hasmonean as well. His portrait graces this hall.
Yes.
We're running out of time, but perhaps just a couple of final points. We're fast forward many decades. Baruch Hashem, you've built a wonderful family with children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Please God, a chassan coming up on Sunday week of a granddaughter, a very special person. We're living in a new world. We're living in the post-7th of October world. What are your thoughts, recollections about the current world situation in light of your life experience?
As I matured, having come to Great Britain, initially I thought I had been taken to experience life in Gan Eden. It was like living in paradise when I came to this country aged 16. As I matured, I began to understand that there is an Almighty God. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that during my 3.5 years in the camps, I did not give God a thought. I was a little uneducated boy. I had sort of a very, very flimsy understanding of what it meant to be Jewish. I could just about read Hebrew, and I understood some of our background, but not very much. And it began to dawn on me that whatever I lacked in understanding, there had to be an Almighty God. I began to realize that we were surrounded by daily miracles, and we just took them for granted. Many people wouldn't call them, they called them nature. But it dawned on me that nature means HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I became a believing, a faithful Jew. As soon as I rejoined my father, he of course taught me how to put on tefillin. I had a bar mitzvah, but I had no tefillin. So I began putting on tefillin, but it was all done sort of without much understanding of what it all meant. But eventually I did understand, and I realized, even though initially I felt I couldn't really say the words of tefillah with meaning, because speaking to God on the basis of God being just and merciful was not what I had experienced. But once I understood that we are all in the hands of God, each one of us, it began to dawn on me that we are praying to the same God as did Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and therefore God self-evidently is eternal. We are finite beings who have a finite mind, and if God did not want our finite minds to be able to comprehend why the Holocaust had to take place, then I had to accept that. And once I had reached that conclusion, once I reached that stage of my development, I really became not only a practicing Jew, but a faithful and believing Jew, and I have remained so for the
October the 7th,
rest of my life.
That's what he asked for.
You didn't ask about October the 7th.
I'm going to conclude the assembly in a very unusual manner. There are many take-homes from today's interview and talk. The privilege of education that you missed for all those years. You left school when you were 9 years old, only to sort of be re-educated many years later. The privilege of living a free and happy life in a Malchus Shel Chesed. But I'm going to do something a little bit unusual, but I'll preface it with a story. In the 1970s, one of the great personalities in the Jewish world was the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Teitelbaum. He happened to be in Israel, which was his last visit. Before he set back to America, his Hasidim came to him and said, Rebbe, when you go back to America, we are living in Israel. Where are we going to go to for a bracha? And this is what he told them. He famously said that you go to the Zichron Moshe Stiebel factory or you go to any other shul, and when you see a man roll up his sleeve and put on tefillin, and there are numbers on his arm, you get a bracha from him, because his brachas are more precious than anything I can bless you with. We are in the presence of greatness. I've known Mr. and Mrs. Goldberg for many years. Mrs. Goldberg, Mrs. Shari Goldberg was in school with my father. And I sit not that farther away now. Every Shabbos morning in Hashkama we daven in the same minyan. It's a privilege to be in the same minyan as both, not just Mr. Goldberg, but also Mrs. Goldberg. To close the assembly, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Goldberg, this is the parsha of Yisimcha Lekim Kefraim L'chim Nashe, Parshas Vayechi.
Yes.
Please bless the students.
I don't mind telling you that when this atrocity took place on October the 7th and all these consequences followed, like at least a great number of you, I was shattered. I didn't dream that I would ever experience seeing Jewish people butchered by the 100, by the 1,000. And I had sleepless nights. I began pondering on what it all meant. And recently, I have been asked to give chizuk to various groups of people during the past year plus. And I would like to repeat to you what I concluded. It became clear to me that we have been in a long, long goals, and over these past centuries, there have been quite a number of attempts to destroy the Jewish people by enemies who were more or less world-class empires, and each one of these attempts was unsuccessful. They have disappeared from history, while we Jewish people are here as spiritually active and devout to Almighty God as we have been in the past. It became suddenly clear to me that in going through the Parshiot with the Rav who was appointed to guide me, I learned that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a deal with the Jewish people. HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose the Jews to be a light unto the nations of the world, on condition that we lived such a life. HaKadosh Baruch Hu granted us a form of eternity. The reason none of these attempts to exterminate the Jews in the past was successful was because HaKadosh Baruch Hu must have accepted that the way we Jews were living our lives, we were indeed fulfilling our commitment, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved us to continue doing his job for him ongoingly, and I felt that incredibly serious as our situation nowadays is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not forget, even though we may stray, we're an Am K'shei Orav, we're a stiff-necked people, nevertheless, even in its short existence, I believe, although Medinat Yisrael is not perfect by any means, nevertheless, it is establishing the same honor for the Jewish people of being a light unto the nation. There is no other nation like the people of Israel. And I would like to give you the reassurance that as long as we fulfill our part of our contract with Almighty God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Be'ezras Hashem, may continue to look after us. Personally, I wish all of you a life of goodness, nachas, and please God, all of you should be a lifelong source of nachas to your parents.
Amen. Amen. I want to, on your behalf, thank Mr. Goldberg for his efforts and Mrs. Goldberg for being here today. It's not an easy day. There's normally a jug of water on the table, but both Mr. and Mrs. Goldberg are both fasting. It's Asara B'Teves, and they declined my offers of any drinks. And I thank you very much for both for coming and giving me of your time, giving us of your wonderful talk. Can you please stand whilst Mr. and Mrs. Goldberg leave the hall?
Sorry?